Hello, everybody. This is going to be chapter 14 onward. I'm probably going to do a few of these, but I wanted to say that if I sound sick, it is because I am sick right now, and I wanted to get this done because it is a fun thing for me to do. So, let's start with chapter 14 Boss Battle. Marcy doesn't like Sasha. That was a given. After everything she'd done, everything that she had put her and Anne through, if she was anything less than distrustful of her, she'd have to be insane. But she couldn't say that she hated her either. She wanted to. God knew she wanted to. With every fiber of her being, every speck of her soul, she wanted to be able to look at her and see nothing more than a monster. A blight on her life she'd be better off without. That the world would be better off without. But she couldn't. Because the girl sitting across from her is just that. A girl. A girl with sunken eyes and cheekbones, protruding at odd, painful-looking angles, scars that line her body like a patched-up air balloon, and short, sloppily cut blonde hair, near white with the pallor of malnourishment. The girl sitting here in front of her isn't a monster or a devil waiting for a chance to strike. She's Sasha, masquerading as a skeleton that bites more often than it should. One who apparently sucks ass at chess. Check. Sasha says the word almost like she's afraid to declare it, a suspicious glint in her eyes as she lifts her finger from her knight. Almost bored, Marcy flicks her pawn forwards with the tip of her nail, knocking the knight over in one fell swoop. As she lifts the discarded white piece from the board, Sasha groans in frustration and reaches up to pull at the roots of her hair. Chess is just the latest in their conquest, though admittedly the first that Sasha has had trouble with. Neither of them are great at talking, and so after their second day of awkwardly sitting in silence for more than 3 hours, Marcy had decided to take matters into her own hands. The first had been card games. Some they remembered from the human world, and once they had exhausted those, some they'd learned in Amphibia. Chess was only the latest of their games, and only because Marcy got tired of losing to Sasha at Newtopian Ratscrew. But going by how Sasha is doing at their chess games, Marcy has a sneaking suspicion they'll be changing games again soon. I swear you weren't as good as this back home. Sasha grumbles, petulant and reluctantly castles. I've had more practice, Marcy counters dryly. She surveys the board for a few moments before sliding her bishop up 3 spaces. Sasha's brow furrows, and she casts a questioning look. With who, Anne? Her left rook moves 2 spaces to the right. I don't think Anne knows how to play chess. Marcy's knight snaps forward to capture the rook, and Sasha grunts in disapproval. That doesn't answer my question. Marcy snorts. Remind me which one of us is technically a prisoner. Sasha's bishop is the next to go, earning another grunt. I don't have to answer all your questions. Sasha glares. It's not like the glares that they used to share. There's no real heat behind it and no intent to do actual harm. It's just a look. Nothing more, nothing less. Are you going to keep eating ass, or do I need to throw this pawn at your skull? Marcy rolls her eyes. You'd be lucky if you even hit me, Noodle Arms. The face that Sasha makes is dangerously close to a pout, and she, predictably, hurls an aforementioned pawn at Marcy's head. Marcy ducks. There's a hollow clattering noise against the wall. Marcy's rook slides 3 spaces to the left. Check. Sasha grunts once more and pulls her knight to the right. Marcy slides forward a pawn. Checkmate. Sasha flips the board, scattering pieces everywhere and whacking Marcy in the face with several of them. Fuck off. Marcy laughs. It's strange, she thinks, that they've reached a point where they can laugh at each other. She still wouldn't call them friends, certainly not, but they aren't enemies either. And they're definitely too familiar to be acquaintances. She doesn't really know what to call her relationship with Sasha other than comfortable. They're comfortable with each other. Honestly, that's the best she could have hoped for. Sasha continues cursing up a storm before picking up several of the fallen pieces and continuing to pelt Marcy with them. Marcy grabs the chessboard to use as a makeshift shield, still trembling from poorly contained laughter. "It's not my fault that you don't know what you're doing," she says, and it sounds dangerously close to a tease. Sasha shouts another round of expletives and starts trying to wrestle the chessboard from her grasp so she can bash her over the head with it. Marcy throws her head back and cackles. Comfortable. That's all it is. Comfortability. No less, no more. The wrestling match ends with Marcy flat on her back, arms raised to shield her face, and Sasha heaving like she just ran a marathon with a boulder tied to her back. The past week has proven beneficial for her, and she's definitely in a lot better health than she was at the start of her imprisonment, but she still gets winded far too easily. That first visit on her own had been an eye-opener. Marcy had come with the intent to either lecture Sasha into eating or finally give her a piece of her mind without Anne there to intervene. But the moment she'd seen her through that middle door, shoulders hunched, hair matted, disturbingly pale and small, she didn't have it in her. It finally sunk in that there was no point anymore. Sasha was already at her lowest point. She couldn't bring her any lower if she tried. She was doing better now, at least as far as Marcy could tell. She still had that look of on death's door about her, but she could sit up straight and stand on her own. That was a pretty good amount of improvement for just over a week, she thought. The current predicament she found herself in just seemed to prove that further. If Sasha felt well enough to try to bash her skull in with a chessboard, she was healing just fine. "Asshole!" Sasha finishes with a final breathless declaration and flops backwards, nearly giving herself a concussion against her bed frame. Marcy continues cackling from her place on the floor. "It's only fair," she coughs between bouts of laughter, earning a violent nudge from what she assumes is Sasha's foot. "Fuck off," she wheezes. Slowly, Marcy gets her breathing back under control and begins to pull herself into a sitting position. "I feel like you swear more than you used to." She smirks at the glare she receives. Sasha's shoulders are still rising and falling in rapid breath. A bit of sweat glistens on her chin. "My only company for the last couple of months has been a literal army, jackass. Don't think I haven't noticed how much more comfortable you've gotten with it, too." Marcy hums, non-committal. "I believe the term is called code switching. I don't swear nearly this much around anyone. You, on the other hand..." Sasha flips her off. Marcy snorts and then picks up the now discarded chessboard, beginning to set it up for another round. Sasha groans, slumping back so that her chin is pointed at the ceiling. "Do we have to play another round?" Marcy rolls her eyes. "If you've got another idea, I'd love to hear it." She can feel Sasha's pout even without looking up to see it, and it startles her just how much she reminds her of Anne. "Aren't prisoners supposed to get, yard time or something?" She rebuffs instead of offering an actual suggestion, and Marcy thinks if she rolls her eyes anymore, she's going to pop a blood vessel. "I'm working on it, okay? The utopian prison system is way behind what someone would consider humane or performative. As much as I'd love to just redesign it all and call it a day, there's logistics I've got to worry about. The least of which being public approval." Okay, sheesh. Sasha cuts her off, but when Marcy finally looks up from the board to glare at her, she isn't met with an expression of frustration, nor one of annoyance. If anything, she looks sympathetic. "You do really put a lot of work into this, don't you?" Marcy blinks, taken aback by the sudden shift of conversation into something resembling seriousness. They haven't had a serious conversation in a while, mostly because they both know that the line of civility they walk is a thin one. Then again, getting transported here is one of the few things that Marcy can't blame Sasha for. "What else am I supposed to do?" she counters by a way of explanation. "They needed help, and I could help. It's as simple as that." Sasha is quiet for a long, extended moment. Then, "Did you know your eyes glow?" She says that. What? Sasha's lips press together and she pulls her knees to her chest. When Anne and I had when I attacked her, when she says it, she winces. She screws up her face into something that resembles pain, but she says it anyway. I thought I was imagining it, but then... She trails off. Marcy waits. But then you showed up, your eyes. She shivers. I've never seen anything that shade of green. My eyes are brown, Marcy mutters absently, but Sasha just glares at her. I know that, smartass. She lets out a sigh and visibly forces herself to relax. My point is, Amphibia has changed us. And I don't just mean in the we're probably all going to need therapy way. I don't think we ended up here by accident, and I'm not so sure we can leave. Upset Spike. Marcy stares at her for probably longer than is considered polite. Did you hit your head? The look that flashes across Sasha's face is the closest thing to offended that she's seen from her in a long time. But before she can start cussing her out again, they're interrupted by the scrape of the cell door. The nude that enters is recognizable to Marcy only by face, and only because she's seen it so often that it sometimes haunts her in her nightmares. Captain Marcy. Her first lieutenant starts, and all the muscles in Marcy's spine and face tighten instinctually at this title. She's on her feet before she even thinks to move, and she suddenly feels stunningly naked without her armor and cloak. Lieutenant, how can I help you? The Newt's face is carved from stone, a trait that's so common among Newt soldiers, it's harder to find one without one. But they've been under fire enough that Marcy can recognize the worry in their eyes. There's been a breach. Marcy's heart stops. As of 10 minutes ago, your leave is revoked, and all militants, both past and present, have been called into active duty. We're under attack. Calling the next few minutes a blur wouldn't be totally accurate, because Marcy remembers them clear as day, but there's a certain disconnect between the events that play out in them and what choices Marcy consciously makes. She's moving on instinct, or maybe not instinct, but rather protocol. Regardless, something wells up inside her, something cold and calculated, and as hard as steel. It pushes against her ribcage and pulls all doubt, all emotion from her mind. Her hand latches around Sasha's wrist, and the next thing she knows, they're in a carriage waiting at the base of the prison, and she's halfway through barking orders at the front man. She knows how they got there, how they walked down the stairs, and she shot the warden a dirty look when he tried to open his mouth to say something about taking his highest profile prisoner. She knows that Sasha had tried to say something multiple times on the way, and she had ignored every attempt. She knows that her lieutenant gave her a brief of the exact situation, a two-pronged attack, one at the east wall, on the other the west, but all of it washed over her like a tidal wave, never really stopping in time for her to process it. It's only once they're in the privacy of the carriage car that her brain manages to catch up with her body. She releases her grip on Sasha's arm, only to find a red handprint in its place. Before she left, back in the prison, Anna had accused her of having some sort of mood swing going on. They hadn't had the time nor the mental energy to dig into that particular comment at the time, but suddenly Marcy feels like they probably should have. She can't remember the exact wording, but the phrase soldier rattles around in her head like a clapper in a bell. Her spine is as stiff as a board. Her hands, now pulled from Sasha's arm, rest in her lap, perfectly crossed, and an exact mirror of her lieutenant across from her in the carriage. Her face is a mask of perfect indifference, and when she speaks, her voice comes out so level it hurts. Do we have an idea of the numbers? She doesn't miss the way that Sasha twitches. The lieutenant's eyes snap to hers, clearly not expecting another round of conversation, though that shouldn't be surprising at this point. Marcy always likes to have all of her cards on the table. 1,500 on the east, 800 on the west. Marcy's hands ball into fists, and before she can stop herself, turns to face Sasha. She looks unnerved. It's in the tilt of her brows, the shrinking of her pupils, the tightness of her shoulders, the trembling in her hands. Fear, like a deer caught in the headlights or a kicked puppy dragged on its leash. No, something argues, something that is still hot and angry and grieving. She's not a puppy, she is not blameless, she is not the victim. Still, when Marcy speaks, some of the ice melts from her tone. How many soldiers does Grime have? Sasha doesn't answer. She just keeps staring at her with that unnerved expression, her eyes slowly taking on a distant quality. It hits her then that if they were using Sasha as collateral against Grime, assuming he cared enough about her that he'd withhold an attack for fear of getting hurt, what was to say that care only went one way? And this was war. War where Marcy was basically asking Sasha to choose between her loyalties. Her loyalty should be to Anne. That hot thing hisses. Her loyalty should not be to something you need to question. But Marcy knows that just like Anne, and just like herself, how easy it is to get invested in this world and the people in it. How easy it is to tie yourself to a cause without entirely knowing its purpose or its ideology. She is the commander of an army that she didn't know the structure of when she first got the job. She is single-handedly responsible for a great number of Newtopia's recent renovations and all that comes from her inability to remain impartial. Because she decided to care about Newtopia without regard to what might mean in the future. Can she blame Sasha for doing the same? She switches focus. What's the damage? She turns back to her lieutenant, and though her expression is still carefully blank, she can sense the disapproval. Part of her, the part that is fully invested in Utopia, agrees with them, but the other part, the one that remembers, did I do something wrong? Maybe. Won't let her act on it. They've taken sectors 9 and 10 and are working on sector 5. The general has already sent 7 companies to try and push back the line on sector 10. Marcy curses under her breath. Casualties? 7 confirmed, more than expected. Any officers? No. We're heading to Command Central? Affirmative. Marcy nods to herself. How are we looking on sector 5? Last I heard, there were 5 companies there. More on the way. Marcy frowns. He's going to spread our perimeter to 4,000. Marcy's teeth click shut as she whips her head to the left. Sasha has drawn her knees up to her chest, and her eyes still have that vacant quality to them. But she definitely spoke. Her lips are still trembling. She doesn't look at her when she repeats herself. Grime has 4,000 units, including air support. Marcy sucks in a breath. He has what? For a long, tense moment, Sasha doesn't respond. Then she hangs her head. The bones of her spine stick out like dragon scales. Air support, dragonflies, and mounted crossbows. Marcy can feel the blood leaving her face. She looks up at her lieutenant, who looks equally pale. Any sign of that? No. Fuck. Marcy begins rummaging through the carriage, looking for any sort of parchment and or paper. Her lieutenant hands her a quill, and though riding in a moving carriage isn't ideal, it isn't the first time she's had to do it. What are you? Sasha's voice is hoarse, but Marcy doesn't have the time nor the patience to dwell on that. Bow, she barks, and is handed the object seconds later. Quickly, she rips off a strip of her shirt and ties the roll of parchment to the arrow before notching it and leaning out the side of the carriage to shoot. As she draws back the bowstring, it finally hits her just how far she's come. She can shoot a bow, she knows how to strategize, she knows a trap when she sees one, and she's confident enough in herself to send orders to the general instead of just following theirs. She lets the arrow fly and watches as it arches over the rooftops towards the palace until it disappears from sight. The streets are eerily quiet, not a newt in sight, and she can just barely make out the orange glow of fires along the distant wall. Evacuation, she knows. All civilians would have been relocated to the inner sectors by now, but it's still frightening to see how normally vibrant streets suddenly empty and devoid of life. We're going to have to skip the armory, her lieutenant mutters when she's been reseated. Marcy nods her agreement. I'll make do with what's on hand in CC. Her lieutenant frowns. And her? They point to Sasha, who still looks like she swallowed something particularly unpleasant. She flinches at being addressed. It wells up in Marcy's chest, and once she knows it's there, it's impossible to ignore. She stays with me. Protectiveness. Marcy wakes up with a pounding in her skull and the taste of gravel in her mouth. Everything feels heavy and sluggish, her vision a little more than muddy shapes swimming through the slits of her eyes. The ground trembles beneath her prone body. Wait, why is she laying on the floor? She's supposed to be going somewhere important. What was it again? Her hands find purchase on the ground, but when she goes to push herself up, a blinding pain racks her body. Light flashes around her, her entire spine is on fire, and her right leg feels like someone's twisting it inside of its socket. A cry spills from her lips, tearing through her throat and sending a violent rattling cough following it. Her face reacquaints itself with the stone beneath it, and she becomes suddenly, painfully aware of something wet and sticky pulling beneath her. What happened? She doesn't remember. All she knows is she's in pain. There's a ringing in her ears, loud and high-pitched and piercing. It takes a good few minutes for her to even muster up the strength to force her eyes open. The world is in ruins. Splotches of brick and mortar, the remnants of buildings hollowed out from some sort of blast. Just a few feet away is the broken remains of what was once a carriage, the shattered wheel laid on its side. Flames lick at objects in the corners of her vision, never still enough for her to get a good look at their source. The sky has turned ashen gray. Whether from clouds or smoke, she can't tell, though she can taste both rain and ash on her breath. There is a shadow before her, limbs long and tall as it stands, moving and gesticulating wildly. It takes much too long for her to realize that she recognizes the shadow. Sasha. Her eyes are like two bruises embedded deep in her skull, and her sweater leaves her looking small, but the shadows of the fire paint her as more like a skeletal demon than a bag of bones that could be knocked over with a breath. She's clutching what looks like a pipe in one hand, the other spread before her as she shouts. All Marcy can hear is that high-pitched whining, but she can see her teeth catch the light, jaw moving viciously up and down as her shoulders heave with the effort of producing sound. On the edges of Marcy's vision, large shapes bob, but she can't quite make them out. Slowly, carefully, Marcy presses her hands against the concrete to try and push herself up again. It's slow going, and it's extremely painful, but patience breeds perseverance, and that always goes rewarded. She makes it to her elbows, then her left knee, then slowly eases herself backwards until she's mostly upright. A heavy numbness has descended over her, and the pain becomes an afterthought. There's something wrong with her right leg. She can't feel it or move it, and everything in that area is pervaded with something hot and wet. Vaguely, she thinks it might be broken, but the thought only registers for a moment, and then it's gone. Her head feels like boiling soup. Occasionally there are glimpses of something that might be solid, a thought that crystallizes for just a moment, but it's snatched away, leaving behind only a bubbling broth she can't see through. Does that even make sense? Don't fucking care, just back off. Oh, the ringing is gone. It takes more effort than it should to raise her head towards the sound, but once she does, she finds that the shapes have gotten closer, and Sasha is now holding the pipe with both hands, brandishing it like a club. The shapes, no, blobs, no, toads, look perplexed. Marcy isn't sure how she can read the facial expressions of vaguely anthropomorphic frog people, but she gets the nagging suspicion that shouldn't be her first concern. Sasha, geez, one of the toads calls. Toads can talk. But Sasha just turns to point her pipe at him. I'm not kidding around, Percy. Another toad takes a step forward, and Sasha spins to face them. She stumbles somewhat, and Marcy can't help but sympathize. Kid, I think you need to calm. I'm not going back with Grime. It's like all the air gets sucked out of the world. Everything comes to such a sharp and dramatic standstill that for a moment Marcy thinks she's imagining it. But no. The fire is still casting warping, twisting shadows, and there are still large booms and shouting in the distance. Is that so? The words cut through the stillness like a knife. The approaching toad isn't any taller than the others, nor any larger, but his armor looks at least twice as thick, and one of his eyes has a glassy blue sheen. Their surrounding toads give him a wide berth as he strolls leisurely through their rings. Marcy doesn't miss how Sasha's grip seems to get tighter on the pipe. "I'll admit, when you went missing, I had my suspicions." His voice is low and gravelly and rough, like someone spent a few days choking down bags of gravel and then picked up smoking for the next 30 years. It grates on her ears and sends unpleasant shivers down her spine. He continues his approach until he stands about 8 feet in front of Sasha. His brow, if you could call it that, lowers in a disapproving scowl, so intense she can feel the years being taken off her life. "But I deign to give you the benefit of the doubt." Sasha's lips pull back from her teeth in an awfully animalistic sneer. Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added rigidity of malnourishment, she looks remarkably... fucking hell. Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added Fuck. Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added rigidity. Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added rigidity. Fucking hell. Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added Her facial features have always been sharp, but with the added rigidity of malnourishment, she looks remarkably lupine. Well, that was your second mistake. The words are dry, all things considered. There's no anger in her tone, no charged emotion at all, really. It's unsettling, especially considering how much Sasha is known for her temper. The toad, Grime if she had to guess, gives his own sneer, and if his face weren't so round, it'd be a perfect mirror of Sasha's. "Tell me, girl, what was my first?" "A challenge." Sasha has always been good at challenges. "Making me choose." There's a brief moment, where Grime looks taken aback. Maybe even startled, but it disappears just as quickly as it comes. He reaches to his belt and closes a hand around the grip of his sword. "This is war, child. I thought you understood that." Sasha laughs, but there's no amusement in the sound. It is dry and empty and cold. "I understand plenty." She starts and somehow takes a step forward. "I understand that the only reason we started working together was because I was beneficial to you. I understand that the only reason you even have an army to begin with was because I was there making them like you, making them trust you. Without me, you'd still be a sad little sack of mucus, sitting alone in an abandoned windmill." That, Sasha, is familiar. Marcy's head might hurt a little too much to piece it together fully, but she knows it's important, that it's significant. That Sasha showed up now, that she hasn't been around in a while. Grimes' face contorts, but Sasha doesn't let up. She keeps advancing on him, and perhaps, surprising to Marcy most of all, he takes a step back. "I trained you," he argues. "I gave you purpose." "So did I," Sasha shouts back. "Who was there for you after the tower fell? After everyone left you? Who picked up your stupid fucking broken pieces and put you back together?" Something has changed in Sasha's posture. Something has lifted. She's standing taller. Her grip on the pipe is more sure. Her steps are level and graceful, like a cat stalking its prey. Grime steps away, and the two begin to circle each other. Sasha's pipe is still branded like a weapon, but Grime keeps his sword sheathed. "I did the same." "No, you didn't. You complained about my every word if it didn't help you. You never listened to me unless you thought you'd benefit from it. I listened to you moan about that Anne girl for months. You told me to kill her. Clearly, I should have done it myself." They freeze. Sasha's taken aback to Marcy once more. She sucks in a breath, and her shoulders rise to her ears. "What?" Two heads snap toward her, and suddenly Marcy realizes that came from her own mouth. Shit. Grimes' expression slowly, ever so grotesquely, morphs into a smile so sharp it could kill. "Oh, Sasha," he says, and his voice is suddenly soft, saccharine, sympathetic, maybe even apologetic. Sasha, though she's still looking at Marcy, goes rigid. She knows that tone. Don't tell me you found another one. Her hands tighten on the rope. Grime. She says it like a warning, but she's shaking. Perhaps this can be a learning opportunity. His voice is light now, casual. He knows he's already won. About what happens when you disobey. Finally, he pulls his sword from his belt. I've been very lenient with you, Sasha, and that was because you earned my respect. But clearly, I've been too soft. He scrapes the tip against the concrete, and Marcy can't help but curl a bit in on herself. Let this be a lesson that I will not make the same mistake again. He lunges deceptively fast for a creature so large. His feet kick off from the ground with enough force to send him sailing towards her, but he hardly makes it more than a few steps before the heavy metallic thunk of Sasha's pipe becomes acquainted with his stomach. Her eyes are bright and burning fuchsia. Somewhere in the back of Marcy's mind, she gets the feeling that this is significant as well. He stumbles back, although he doesn't look mad. If anything, he looks thrilled. That large, grotesque grin never left his face, and now he throws back his head for a loud, wheezing laugh to match. That's my girl. He lunges again, but this time his strike is not intended for Marcy. It is a chaotic dance, one that she would probably follow better if her head didn't still feel like someone was repeatedly clobbering her over the head with a hammer. As it is, it looks more like two brown blurs occasionally colliding and departing from one another, loud grunts and shouts ringing out in their wake. Grime is all heavy swings and blunt cuts, going for quick and a violent end to the bout. Sasha is smaller and uses her size to her advantage, dodging in and out of his range with a grace that would seem otherworldly if she didn't look like a light breeze would send her flying. Her eyes remain that bright color, though, striking through the smoke and shadows like twin miniature flames mounted inside of her skull. Her weapon is blunted, and so, rather than going for the cuts that Grime is, she takes for landing violent pokes and whacks after one and the other, making loud connections that are sure to leave bruises for the next few days. Grime is older, however, and much more experienced, magic or no magic. He catches one of Sasha's swings with an outstretched hand, and Sasha just has time to scream, "Fuck!" before she's thrown. She lands in a heap in front of Marcy. Something makes a sickening, crunching noise on impact. Her head is still swimming, and she can barely get a coherent thought to materialize, but her hand reaches out with her input and rests on Sasha's shoulder. Grime stands, heaving, and lets out a triumphant laugh. "You've grown weak over your stay," he chides, stepping over the discarded pipe like it was never a threat to begin with. Sasha sits up, slow and wheezing all the while. When she makes it to her knees, she looks up at Grime and spits a clod of something red at his feet. "You're not the only one who grieves like a little bitch." His smile falls, that disapproving scowl in its place once more. "I'm going to give you a week in the hole," he hisses, "just to make sure the lesson sticks." The sword comes down with all the force of a guillotine. Blood sprays across Marcy's face. It happens so fast she barely sees it, barely even comprehends what happened. One moment, Grime is swinging a killing blow. The next, his own sword is impaled into his good eye. Sasha caught it. She caught the blade with her bare hand. Her right hand, to be more exact, which is only hanging onto itself by bone and a few stubborn bands of muscle, cut right into the palm, blood spattered up over her fingers and down the wrist, flowing down like a river unbidden. A dam that is broken for the world to see as tides of blood drip to the floor and light, hysterical laughter flows from its owner. She caught the blade and used the force of its own trajectory to wrench the grip from Grime's hand before shoving it into Grime's face, pommel first. He falls to his knees, but it doesn't matter because Sasha is laughing. Head thrown back, blood dripping down her hand as she presses it against her temple, leaving the red stain to fall down her face as well. She laughs and laughs and laughs, teeth bared to an unforgiving sky as it lets out its first clap of thunder, and the rain begins to pour down. The surrounding toads back away, something between horror and awe written in their faces. Somewhere deep in Marcy's muddled brain, something whispers about the toads being a culture that respected strength over all else, but it's gone before she can even think to voice it. Lightning flashes overhead, and between that and the dancing flames, Sasha looks like a demon, a monster. Her eyes gleam with their own light, pink but bordering on crimson with its intensity. But the surrounding flesh is so dark it's nearly black. Her sunken cheeks, the bloody side of her face, the distant flames create a distorted shadow that hides the majority of her face, so that you can just barely make out the edge of her jaw and her teeth as they glint in the lightning. The front of her sweater has been ripped apart, so it hangs over her shoulder loosely like a pair of tattered wings. A long, thin red gash starts just below her collarbone and ends just above her navel. She looks like a monster. Marcy doesn't know why that makes something inside of her chest itch. She doesn't know a lot of things. She knows this is bad, that whatever is going on is going to end badly for them, but she can't exactly figure out why, nor find it within herself to care. Thunder cracks overhead once again, and this time it doesn't seem to end. If anything, it continues ringing until it's all she can hear, until it's rattling around, crackling inside of her skull. She lifts a hand to press it against her temple, but without its support, the world suddenly lurches to the right. She's on the ground before she even realizes she lost balance. Her skin feels wet and cold, and it sticks uncomfortably to the ground beneath her. Her eyes are open, but she can't make a sense of what is before them anymore. It's just a tidal wave of color. Grays and browns and reds and oranges and pink, all melting together until a kaleidoscope of shapes and colors looks back at her, and her eyes start to feel like overinflated balloons. She presses them shut to try and relieve the pain, but the next time she opens them, the world has changed. It's dark now, and a face is hovering over her own. With Mars here, stay awake. Her hearing pulses in and out, snatches of words. The mouth on the face is moving, but she can't make sense of it. Can't make sense of anything. She can't even recognize the face. Marcy.